Everyone knew that Lucille Ball had been ill, and everyone felt immensely relieved when it appeared that Lucy was doing better. Well, today she died suddenly. She was 77.
She built one of the most powerful empires in Hollywood history, owned her show before any actor dared to try, and died with a fortune most executives could only dream of. But here's what almost nobody talks about. Lucille Ball, the woman who never left anything to chance, left behind a very specific plan for every single dollar she had. No courtroom drama, no bitter family feud, no Hollywood scandal. Just a woman who was as sharp with a will as she was with a punchline. So who actually walked away with her $40 million fortune? And was it really as clean and simple as the headlines made it seem? The empire nobody expected her to own. Most people remember Lucille Ball as the redhead who couldn't stop getting into trouble on screen. What they forget is that off-screen, she was the one running the table. Before we talk about who inherited her money, we need to understand exactly what kind of money we're talking about, because this wasn't just a TV star's savings account. This was a carefully constructed financial empire that started with one decision CBS probably still regrets. In 1951, when CBS approached Lucille and her then-husband Desilu about turning their radio show into a television sitcom, the network had one major condition. The show had to be filmed live in New York. Lucille refused. She and Desi were based in Los Angeles, and she wasn't about to uproot her life for a network that didn't fully believe in her vision. She countered with a proposal. They would film in Hollywood, in front of a live studio audience, using a 3-camera setup that had never been done before on television. CBS agreed, but with a condition of their own. If Lucille and Desi wanted to do it their way, they had to foot the production bill themselves. Most people would have walked away. Lucille wrote the check. They used their own money to produce I Love Lucy, and in exchange, they retained ownership of every single episode. At the time, nobody in Hollywood thought that mattered. Television was seen as disposable entertainment, something you watched once and forgot. The idea that these recordings would ever be worth anything seemed almost laughable. But when reruns became a thing, and networks realized audiences would happily watch the same episodes over and over again, that ownership became one of the most valuable assets in entertainment history. Every time I Love Lucy aired anywhere in the world, Lucille Ball got paid. That was still true the day she died. It was still true years after. The couple formalized this operation under a company called Desilu Productions, which they founded together in 1950. What started as a practical arrangement to manage their own show quietly grew into something much bigger. By the mid-1950s, Desilu wasn't just producing I Love Lucy. It was renting studio space to other productions, expanding its facilities, and becoming a genuine player in the Hollywood infrastructure. The lots they operated on had previously belonged to RKO Pictures, a studio Lucille had once worked for as a contract player, a detail that wasn't lost on her when she signed the paperwork. She wasn't just building something new. She was building it on ground that had once told her she wasn't quite leading lady material. Lucille wasn't just a performer anymore. She was a landlord, a producer, and a business owner, all at once. Then came the moment that truly separated her from every other actress of her generation. In 1960, after her marriage to Desi collapsed, and the two agreed to part ways professionally as well, Lucille bought out Desi's shares in Desilu Productions. That single transaction made her the sole owner of a Hollywood studio, not a partner, not a co-founder, the owner. She became the first woman to run a major Hollywood production company, sitting at the head of a business that was, at that point, producing some of the most watched television in America. And she didn't stop there. Under her leadership, Desilu greenlit 2 projects that most other studios had passed on. One was a science fiction show about space exploration that many executives thought was too strange and too expensive. The other was an espionage thriller that didn't fit neatly into any existing format. Those 2 shows were Star Trek and Mission Impossible. Both became cultural institutions. Both were born because Lucille Ball said yes when everyone else said no. In 1967, she sold Desilu Productions to Gulf and Western, the parent company of Paramount Pictures, for roughly $17 million. That sale alone, in today's money, would be worth well over $150 million. But what made that transaction particularly significant was that Lucille negotiated it from a position of genuine strength. She wasn't selling because she was struggling or because the business had peaked. She sold because the offer was right, the timing was right, and she had the financial intelligence to recognize when to hold and when to fold. That kind of clarity is rare in any industry. In Hollywood, it was almost unheard of. Combined with the ongoing royalties from I Love Lucy, her real estate holdings, and decades of careful financial management, Lucille Ball arrived at the end of her life with an estate worth an estimated $40 million, a figure that in today's terms clears $80 million comfortably. This is what was waiting to be inherited, and she already knew exactly where it was going. The woman behind the wealth. Here's something the Hollywood mythology tends to skip over. Lucille Ball was not an overnight success, not even close. For nearly 2 full decades before I Love Lucy made her a household name, she was grinding through a career that offered just enough promise to keep her going and just enough rejection to break anyone with less resolve. She was born in Jamestown, New York, in 1911. The daughter of a telephone lineman named Henry Ball and a young woman named Deddy, who was still a teenager when Lucille arrived. Her father died of typhoid fever when Lucille was 3 years old, leaving her mother to raise 2 children largely on her own. That kind of early instability leaves a mark. Lucille grew up moving between relatives, living at one point with strict step-grandparents who stripped the mirrors from the house and treated any sign of vanity as a character flaw. She was once scolded for admiring her own reflection. It's not hard to see how a childhood like that shapes a woman who would later be obsessed with control, with ownership, with making sure nobody could ever take what was hers. She arrived in New York at 15 to study at the John Murray Anderson School for the Dramatic Arts. But her time there was short and humbling. One of her instructors reportedly told her she had no future in the performing arts. She ignored that, went back to Jamestown, and eventually made her way to Hollywood in the early 1930s, where she spent years doing exactly what struggling actors do, taking whatever work she could find. For most of the 30s and into the early 40s, she worked steadily but without any real breakthrough. She appeared in dozens of films, mostly in minor roles, earning a reputation as a reliable performer and, eventually, a somewhat ironic nickname, Queen of the Bees. She appeared in dozens of films, mostly in minor roles, earning a reputation as a reliable performer and, eventually, a somewhat ironic nickname, Queen of the Bees. It wasn't a compliment. It referred to the low-budget B-movies she kept getting cast in, the ones that studios used to fill out double features. She was capable of more, and she knew it, but the industry kept handing her the same limited ceiling. What kept her going wasn't blind optimism. It was a stubborn, almost methodical approach to the work itself. She studied comedy the way some people study law. She paid attention to timing, to rhythm, to the physical mechanics of making a joke land. She took acting classes, voice lessons, and did everything she could to sharpen tools that the industry hadn't given her a real chance to use yet. She also developed a reputation on set for being unusually prepared. Directors noted that she showed up knowing not just her own lines, but everyone else's, not because she was trying to control the scene, but because she genuinely believed that understanding the full picture made her better at her specific part of it. That habit of thinking in systems, rather than just in individual moments, would later define how she ran a studio. But it started here, on low-budget sets in the 1930s, when nobody was paying particular attention. Her radio career in the mid-40s gave her something film hadn't, the ability to be genuinely funny. On My Favorite Husband, a CBS radio program she started in 1948, she played a scatterbrained but lovable housewife, and discovered something important about herself. She was extraordinarily good at comedy. Not just capable, extraordinary. The audience response was immediate and enthusiastic, and it was that show that eventually caught the attention of CBS television executives who thought the format could translate to the small screen. That pitch meeting led to I Love Lucy, and I Love Lucy led to everything else. But here's what's worth sitting with. Lucille Ball was 40 years old when I Love Lucy premiered. 40. In an industry that routinely discarded women in their 30s, she had spent the better part of 2 decades being underestimated, underpaid, and underused. The fortune she eventually left behind wasn't built on luck or on being in the right place at the right time. It was built on 20 years of showing up when most people would have quietly given up and gone home. The woman who eventually left behind one of the most deliberately organized estates in Hollywood history learned the value of holding on to things by first experiencing what it felt like to have nothing worth holding. That early hunger never fully left her, and it quietly drove every financial and professional decision she made for the rest of her life. That's the foundation underneath the $40 million estate, and it's the reason she was so deliberate about what happened to it. The marriage that built an empire and the divorce that split it. Before Lucille Ball could pass anything on, she first had to survive one of the most public and emotionally complicated marriages Hollywood had ever seen. Because understanding what she inherited and eventually left behind means understanding Desi Arnaz, not just the charming Cuban bandleader audiences fell in love with on screen, but the business partner whose exit from her life cost her personally and handed her something professionally she never expected. They met in 1940 while working on a film called Too Many Girls. Desi was the kind of man who made a room tilt in his direction when he walked in. He was funny, magnetic, and effortlessly charming in a way that was almost disarming. Lucille, by all accounts, fell fast. They married the same year they met, after a brief courtship that moved at the speed of a Hollywood production schedule. For the first decade, the marriage was held together by love, ambition, and the sheer momentum of building something together. But the friction was there from the beginning. Desi toured extensively with his band, which meant long stretches apart. When they were together, the dynamic was complicated by ego, by stress, and eventually by Desi's pattern of infidelity, which was not a well-kept secret in their social circle. What rarely gets mentioned is how long Lucille tried to make it work. She didn't walk away at the first sign of trouble, or the second, or the third. She adjusted, compromised, and absorbed pressure that would have ended most marriages years earlier, partly because she genuinely loved him, and partly because their personal and professional lives were so thoroughly enmeshed that there was no clean line between losing a husband and losing a business partner. Unraveling one meant unraveling everything simultaneously. She filed for divorce in 1960. The timing was significant. The final episode of I Love Lucy as a traditional series had already aired, and both she and Desi had reached a kind of mutual understanding that the professional chapter was closing. The divorce was finalized on the same day the final episode of the Lucy Daisy Comedy Hour was filmed. Whatever you want to say about Lucille Ball's sense of timing, she had it even in heartbreak. The financial settlement that followed the divorce reorganized the Desilu empire in a way that would define the rest of her life. Lucille bought out Desi's shares in the company. The price has been reported at around $2.5 million, which was a substantial figure at the time and one that required significant financial maneuvering on her part. But the result was total ownership. She held every share of Desilu Productions. She ran it alone. That transition wasn't easy. Hollywood had seen female stars before, but female executives were a different matter entirely. She navigated skepticism from the industry, from press, and occasionally from her own staff. Board meetings that she chaired were sometimes described as tense, not because she was unprepared, but because certain people in the room had difficulty taking direction from a woman, regardless of the fact that she owned the room they were sitting in. She pushed through it because she didn't have a choice, and because she was constitutionally incapable of letting doubt have the last word. 1 year after her divorce from Desi, she married Gary Morton, a stand-up comedian who operated in a far quieter corner of the entertainment world. By every account, the marriage was genuinely stable. Gary didn't need to compete with her legacy because he understood it without needing to own a piece of it. He called her by a nickname, kept her laughing in private when the public version of herself grew exhausting, and stood with her through the health scares and quieter years that followed. Desi Arnaz died in December of 1986, just over 2 years before Lucille. In the years between their divorce and his death, they stayed in contact and occasionally spoke warmly of each other in public. There was a phone call, widely referenced in accounts of their later years, in which Desi told her he loved her, and she told him the same. Two people who had built something extraordinary together, who had hurt each other in ways neither fully recovered from, and who had somehow still arrived at something that resembled peace. She outlived him. She inherited the full weight of the Desilu legacy. And when she died, all of it, including what that shared history had built, passed to the next generation.
8 days between a standing ovation and a hospital room.
On April 18, 1989, Lucille Ball walked onto the stage of the Academy Awards alongside Bob Hope and brought the room to its feet. She was 77 years old, her hair was its signature red, and she was, by all visible measures, still entirely herself. Sharp, warm, and completely in command of a room that held most of Hollywood. The audience didn't just applaud politely. They rose, held it, and many of them visibly struggled to compose themselves because they understood, even if they couldn't articulate it in that moment, that they were looking at the end of something irreplaceable. 8 days later, she was gone. In the early hours of April 26th, while recovering at Cedars-Sinai Medical Center from open-heart surgery she had undergone just days before, Lucille Ball died from a ruptured abdominal aortic aneurysm. The surgery had addressed a dissecting aortic aneurysm near her heart, and doctors had initially considered it a success. She had been alert after the procedure, speaking with family, and showing signs of stable recovery. Then, a separate section of the aorta gave way without warning. She lost consciousness and passed at 5:47 in the morning. She had never fully woken from sleep. The news reached the public that same morning, and the response was immediate and overwhelming. Television stations interrupted regular programming. Tributes poured in from every corner of the entertainment industry. For a generation that had grown up watching I Love Lucy, it genuinely felt like losing someone from their own family, which is one of the stranger and more specific powers of television. It puts the same face in millions of living rooms until the distinction between performer and family member starts to blur. What made the shock particularly acute was how recent that Academy Awards appearance had been. She had looked well. She had looked like herself. The interval between that standing ovation and her death was so short that many people who watched the ceremony later said they couldn't stop thinking about it, about the way the room had cheered for her as if time had stopped. And then time very much had not. Lucille was cremated. Her ashes were initially placed at Forest Lawn Memorial Park in Hollywood Hills, near her mother's resting place. But she had expressed a wish, at some point before her death, to be buried in Jamestown, the New York town where she had started. In 2002, her remains and her mother's were moved to the Hunt family plot at Lakeview Cemetery in Jamestown. Her brother Fred was eventually interred there as well. The return to Jamestown closed a particular circle. She had left that town with almost nothing and come back, in a sense, with everything. What she left behind in terms of a physical estate included her Beverly Hills home, her jewelry collection, her personal belongings, and the royalty streams that had been flowing for decades and showed no sign of slowing. The intellectual property alone, the ownership stake in I Love Lucy, and the residual income it generated, represented a financial asset unlike almost anything else in entertainment, because the show never stopped airing. It had been in continuous syndication since its original run ended, which meant it was still generating income in 1989, and it would continue generating income long after. The specific terms of her will were not made entirely public, which is standard for most estates of this size. What became known through reporting and through statements from her family painted a picture of a woman who had organized her affairs with the same precision she applied to everything else in her professional life. There were no surprises in the courtroom, no contested provisions, no family members publicly disputing the terms. Lucille Ball, who had spent her career turning chaos into comedy, made sure that her exit from the world was as orderly as the entrance of a perfectly timed punchline. The question, of course, was who was waiting in the wing. The children who carried the name. Lucie Arnaz and Desi Arnaz Jr. grew up in a house where the television was always on, and their parents were always on it. That particular circumstance of childhood, being the children of America's most famous couple, shaped them in ways both visible and complicated. They were loved publicly before they were known privately, which is a strange kind of pressure to grow up under. Lucy was born in July of 1951, just months before I Love Lucy premiered, making her, in a sense, a contemporary of the show itself. Desi Jr. arrived 2 years later, in January of 1953. Both children were absorbed into the world of Desilu from an early age, appearing on television, watching their parents rehearse, and absorbing the rhythms of an industry that didn't slow down for school schedules or bedtimes. Growing up, the Arnaz household wasn't the kind of environment where fame felt glamorous. It was the backdrop, the wallpaper. What stood out instead were the ordinary tensions of a household under pressure. Parents who worked constantly, a marriage that visibly strained at its edges, and the particular loneliness of being recognized in public before you'd figured out who you were in private. Both children have spoken in interviews about navigating that dynamic, the way it gave them access to extraordinary experiences while simultaneously making certain ordinary ones feel out of reach. Lucille was not, by her own admission or by her children's descriptions, a conventionally soft parent. She was demanding, high expectation, and relentless in pushing both of them to earn whatever they had, rather than assume it. Lucy later described her mother as someone who was always in your corner, but made sure you knew exactly what corner you were standing in and why. Family dinners were loud, honest, and occasionally combative, the way dinners tend to be in households where everyone has an opinion, and nobody has learned to pretend otherwise. Both children pursued entertainment careers, which was perhaps inevitable given the environment in which they had been raised. Lucie Arnaz built a solid career in musical theater and television, eventually earning a Tony nomination and establishing herself as a performer entirely on her own terms. She has spoken in interviews about the challenge of carrying a famous last name, the way it opened certain doors and narrowed others, and the specific emotional labor of being asked about your mother in every single professional context. Desi Arnaz Jr. had a more turbulent path. He worked as an actor and musician, experienced a degree of public celebrity as a young man that he has since described as difficult to navigate, and went through a period of personal struggle that included well-documented substance abuse issues. He eventually found stability and has spoken openly about that period of his life in terms that reflect clarity rather than shame. His recovery and the perspective it gave him shaped how he eventually came to hold the weight of his family's legacy. When Lucille Ball died, both children inherited the bulk of her estate. This included her real estate holdings, her personal property, and, critically, the ongoing royalty income from I Love Lucy. The show was still generating significant revenue in 1989, and it would continue to do so, meaning the inheritance wasn't a fixed sum that could be spent down, but a financial structure that kept producing income over time. The magnitude of that royalty stream is hard to overstate. I Love Lucy had been in continuous syndication since the 1950s, airing in dozens of countries simultaneously. And the licensing fees attached to that kind of global, perpetual broadcast presence accumulate into something genuinely substantial year over year. What Lucy and Desi Jr. inherited wasn't just their mother's past. It was, in a very practical sense, a business that kept running without them having to do anything at all. Beyond the financial inheritance, both children became stewards of their mother's image and legacy in a more active sense. Lucy Arnaz, in particular, has been publicly engaged in shaping how Lucille Ball is remembered, speaking at events, participating in documentaries, and responding when she felt her mother's story was being told inaccurately or incompletely. When a 2021 biographical film about Lucille Ball generated some controversy around its casting and portrayal, Lucy was vocal and direct in her assessment, pushing back publicly in a way that made clear she considered protecting her mother's narrative as much a part of her inheritance as anything financial. There is something Lucille would have recognized in that instinct: the refusal to let someone else control your narrative, the willingness to stand in a room full of people and say, "That's not quite right. Let me tell you what actually happened." She raised them, after all. She was tough on them precisely because she understood that the world wouldn't go easy on anyone carrying that name, and she wanted them ready for it. And in the ways that mattered most, they were. The husband who stayed. Not every piece of Lucille Ball's estate went to her children. Gary Morton, her husband of 28 years, was also included in her will, and his portion of the inheritance reflects something about the marriage itself. It was stable, loyal, and genuinely affectionate in a way that didn't require the spotlight to survive. Gary Morton was not a famous man. He had worked as a stand-up comedian in the Catskill Mountains circuit, which was a specific and well-worn proving ground for comedic performers in mid-century America. But he had never broken through to the level of national celebrity. When he and Lucille married in 1961, just over a year after her divorce from Desi was finalized, the press was skeptical. The general assumption in Hollywood circles was that no one could follow Desi Arnaz in Lucille Ball's life without being measured unfavorably against him. Gary apparently declined to compete with that comparison. By most accounts, he simply showed up, consistently, without drama, for nearly 3 decades. He worked as a producer on several of Lucille's television projects, which gave him a professional role in her world without putting him in the position of trading on her name. People who worked with both of them described him as protective of her, attentive without being controlling, and genuinely funny in the low-key, self-deprecating way that apparently made Lucille laugh in the unguarded, off-script way that didn't happen on set. There's a telling detail in how people who knew the couple privately described the dynamic. Lucille, in professional contexts, was always on. She was always performing at some level, always aware of the room, always calibrating. With Gary, that reportedly dropped. He was one of the few people in her life around whom she could simply be tired or bored or uncertain without it meaning anything beyond the fact that she was human and occasionally exhausted by being Lucille Ball. For a woman who had been performing since she was 12 years old, that particular kind of rest was not a small offering. Lucille had spent years operating at maximum professional intensity. Gary gave her somewhere to put that down. That's not a small thing. His portion of her estate was described in coverage at the time as a comfortable inheritance, not the primary bequest, which went to Lucy and Desi Jr., but a meaningful one that ensured his financial security for the remainder of his life. He died in 1999, a decade after Lucille, having lived quietly in the years following her death. There were no public disputes, no contested claims, no posthumous drama surrounding his share of the estate. He received what she left him, and that was the end of it. The fact that Lucille included him substantively in her will says something worth noting. She was precise about money. She had been poor, had clawed her way to wealth, and understood with complete clarity what financial security meant and what its absence felt like. She didn't distribute her estate carelessly or sentimentally. Every decision in her will reflected deliberate thought. Choosing to provide meaningfully for Gary was a statement about the value she placed on the kind of love that shows up without applause. She had been publicly adored her entire adult life. She knew the difference between people who stayed because of the lights and people who stayed because they wanted to be in the room with her specifically. Gary Morton stayed through the later years, through the health scares, through the quieter decades when the industry had mostly moved on and the calls had stopped coming the way they once did. He stayed. She noticed. And in the most concrete way, she knew how to express it. She made sure he knew. So after everything, here's the question that lingers. If Lucille Ball spent her entire life fighting to own what she built, only to hand it off in the most organized, undramatic way imaginable, does that say more about who she was or about what she was really afraid of losing? Share your thoughts in the comments. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. For more interesting stories like this, be sure to click on the next video that pops up on your screen. You never know what you'll discover next.